Good evening and welcome to the 7th episode of our virtual seminar series this year in the second phase of our pandemic dialogues. We call this Reckoning and Recovery. I'm Paul Carrese, Director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Tonight's webinar is on the post-pandemic world order, great power competition, and the case of China. Part of our school's mission is to promote civic dialogue about pressing issues of our time. And each year, our academic speaker series, the Civic Discourse Project, extends the conversations and debates of our classrooms to a broader community. Arizona PBS records those speaker events and broadcasts them. You can visit our website to see all of our previous lectures in the Civic Discourse Project. That's at scetl.asu.edu. And now, given the events of this spring and summer, we're offering a new virtual series, the Pandemic Dialogues. And we're doing it in two modes. First is these live webinars, which discuss a deeper perspective on pandemics or civic crisis, and also a podcast, which has been discussing Albert Camus' novel, The Plague. More information on these webinars, also on the Camus podcast, and in general information about our school is at, again, scetl.asu.edu. So to continue our discussions of reckoning with and recovery from the current pandemic, we're delighted to welcome an expert on American national security and foreign policy, especially regarding China and the Asia Pacific. This is Dr. Zack Cooper of the American Enterprise Institute. And then joining me to pose questions is my faculty colleague from our School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, Professor Bruce Pagel. We'll have three parts to the webinar this evening: an opening presentation from Dr. Cooper, then questions for him from Colonel Pagel and myself, and in part three, a Q&A session from the virtual community that's joining us. So please do type your questions for our guest using the Q&A feature in Zoom, and our colleague Luke Perez will be collecting those behind the scenes. Then Colonel Pagel and I will take turns posing questions to our guest in part three. I'm told you also can use the hashtag Pandemic Dialogues on Twitter to participate in the discussion. Our expert guest is Dr. Zack Cooper, a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., studying U.S. strategy in Asia. Dr. Cooper also directs the Alliance for Securing Democracy and teaches at Georgetown and Princeton universities. In addition, he's an associate with Armitage International and co-host of the Net Assessment podcast for the website War on the Rocks. Dr. Cooper earned his PhD in security studies and an MPA in international relations from Princeton University. He has served on the staff of the National Security Council in the White House and also on the staff of the Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon. Also served with the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. In addition to many reports and articles, he is the co-editor of two books: Post-War Japan, Growth, Security, and Uncertainty Since 1945, it's from 2017, and Strategic Japan, New Approaches to Foreign Policy and the U.S.-Japan Alliance, from 2014. He's currently writing a book on the rise and fall of great militaries and the relevance of that question for the history, for that historical question for current U.S.-China relations. And then my co-questioner is Colonel Bruce Pagel, who served for 28 years as a judge advocate, a lawyer in the U.S. Army, active and reserve. He retired from active service in 2014. Bruce deployed on multiple occasions to Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan in a variety of senior positions, and he ultimately served as the senior lawyer for U.S. Central Command, the Pentagon command responsible for the Middle East. Colonel Pagel also worked as a federal prosecutor in Virginia and Washington, D.C., where he prosecuted complex drug and money laundering cases and advised senior policymakers on a variety of issues. Professor Pagel currently teaches in our school courses in security policy, civil military relations, and the law of armed conflict as a professor of practice. So thank you both of you for joining us. Dr. Cooper, thank you, and we look forward to your remarks now on the post-pandemic world order, great power competition, and the case of China.
Well, thank you so much, Paul and Bruce. Really appreciate the chance to come speak with you and with the rest of the Arizona State community. I wish I was there in person, but obviously that's not possible, at least in the foreseeable future. And I want to talk a little bit about a couple of different issues. And where I'll start is where I think we're headed in the US-China relationship, and why I think, in fact, the pandemic has made this a much more difficult relationship than it already was. And it was a tricky one. If you go back and think about what the world looked like in January and February, it was not a particularly good relationship at that time, and it's only gotten worse. And then I want to shift a little bit and talk about maybe where things are headed, not just for the US and China, but for the Asia Pacific region more generally. So I think the place to begin is with acknowledging that the US and China are probably at the worst point in their relationship in at least about 30 years, maybe dating back to the Tiananmen Square massacre, after which the relationship almost went into a deep freeze. You could not say the relationship is in a deep freeze now. In fact, it's actually quite hot. There are daily attacks from the White House, from the State Department, against the Chinese Communist Party, and again from the Communist Party itself, from the Foreign Ministry, against senior leaders in the United States, including Secretary Pompeo, National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien just today, who was attacked for a speech he gave in Arizona last week. And so I would say the relationship is as difficult as it has been in quite some time. And I think the reason is in part that the United States and China are incredibly different countries, but Xi Jinping and Donald Trump find themselves in surprisingly similar situations. Why do I say that? Xi Jinping is a very powerful leader in the Chinese system compared to his previous leaders. It used to be that every 10 years, the Chinese leadership would transition. Xi Jinping has made sure that that is not going to happen in 2022. He's likely to stay in power for the foreseeable future. And in exchange, what he and the Communist Party have promised to the people of China is continued economic growth and stable, effective governance. And the pandemic has called both into question. It's called economic growth into question because reportedly the Chinese economy effectively shut down the first quarter of this year. And although the numbers you see coming out of Beijing are pretty good, maybe 6% unemployment, many people say that the actual unemployment rate just in Beijing is 20%. And I think that's probably true across the country. So it's called into question Xi Jinping's economic leadership, but it's also called into question the ability of the Communist Party to deliver on its promises to the Chinese people. And what are these promises? Well, number one was stable, effective governance. And in fact, we saw in November and December and January, there was not stable and effective governance from the Communist Party. It allowed the virus to spread out of Wuhan throughout China, throughout the world, and it really lost control of the situation. And so Xi Jinping finds himself in a very difficult situation now, where he's under incredible pressure to deliver for China, but the problems that have been created by the pandemic and the mishandling of the pandemic by the Chinese Communist Party have called into question not only his leadership, but the Communist Party's ability to provide sufficient leadership as well. So why do I say that that's similar to anything here in the United States? Well, my view is that if you look at what Donald Trump is facing, he also needs to deliver a strong economy. Heading into an election in November, President Trump absolutely needs a strong economy to be able to demonstrate that he's been an effective leader. The stock market's looking okay these days, but a lot of people on Main Street aren't feeling those same bubbles that we've seen in the economy in the stock market the last few weeks. In fact, they're feeling lower paychecks, a high unemployment rate, about 13% right now. So just in time for the election, the US economy is headed south. And at the same time, it's called into question, just like it has in China, the effectiveness of the US government. And here, obviously, the inability of the US government to manage the spread of the pandemic in March and April is something that's going to be blamed on many parts of the US system. But I think at the end of the day, the buck will stop with the president. And so Xi Jinping and Donald Trump are both in a situation where they need economic growth, They need to manage this pandemic. And both, I think, in many senses are failing. And both are, as a result, looking for people to blame. I think the Communist Party started this early on with trying to figure out if there was some way to blame anyone else other than Xi Jinping and senior leaders in the Communist Party for what happened with the virus. You may remember early on, they tried to shut down in late December and early January any talk about what was happening with the virus in China. And then the next move was to start trying to blame foreign countries for the spread of the virus. So in fact, there has been an active disinformation campaign in the United States by the Chinese. People tend to forget this, that the virus actually came into Wuhan through a US Army Special Forces team that was there in Wuhan on a sporting event in the fall. That is a lie. But that is the kind of effort that the Communist Party has gone to try and avoid the blame that they deserve for the spread of the disease in December and January. Now, here in the United States, I think the president has also come under a huge amount of pressure and is looking for someone to blame. And the answer in many cases has been China. And he's right that China is responsible for the spread of the virus, not just throughout China, but also throughout the world, especially the lack of control in the early days. But as we can see, the spread of the virus in the United States in March and April in particular was partially due to the failings of the US government to actually control that and make clear to the American people that this was a serious threat. So we find the United States and China both in incredibly difficult positions and leaders who feel that their backs are very much up against the wall, and they're both blaming each other. And this situation is just worse at the moment, I think, in part because we've seen an effort by some in the political sides of both countries to make out the other one to be the enemy. So in China, we've seen what we call wolf warrior diplomacy, a much more active set of Chinese diplomats who've really been attacking the United States and Europeans and Australians for what they see as efforts to undermine the Communist Party at this difficult time. And then in the United States, we've seen elements from both parties seeking to really go after China for its failings early on. And so the relationship is in a particularly difficult state at the moment. Now, I think there's a follow-on question, which is this going to get any better between now and November? And my answer is no. In fact, if anything, it's likely to get worse. The incentives in both countries, I think, are to play up these differences. Certainly heading into the presidential election here in November, I think we're going to see Joe Biden and Donald Trump both trying to portray the other one as weak on China issues. This is one of the few things they have in common. And so there's very little room for either Donald Trump or Joe Biden to sort of play the peacemaker at the moment. And so I think actually the relationship is likely to get worse. Maybe not significantly worse, but to continue worsening over the next 6 months or so. Now, the rest of the world is watching this closely. And to get back to the point of this discussion tonight, which is how does the pandemic really influence what's happening around the globe and the structure of the regional order and the global order, I think what we're seeing is increasingly a view that actually neither the United States or China appears to be capable and willing of playing the leadership role that many people expected them to play. Now, I wouldn't suggest to you that everyone around the world believes this. Certainly, the US has some very strong allies that are still looking to the United States for leadership. And if you look at any poll of US allies and partners, they actually say they want more of the United States. They want more US leadership. They want more engagement around the world. But they don't feel that that's what they're getting. And so one of the real challenges for the United States now is that it has a strategy, the national security strategy calls America First. And this America First approach is just not very appealing to most of our friends around the world. And so some countries have looked to China for help, for assistance. And I think what they're finding is actually that China is not particularly helpful either. If you look at, say, Australia, which has come under huge pressure the last month, Australia has called for an investigation into the origins of the coronavirus And in exchange, China has put economic and diplomatic sanctions on Australia to try and force them to back away from this insistence on an independent investigation. And they've done the same with others in Europe and beyond. And so we're seeing a real feeling, I think, globally, that neither China nor the United States at the moment is providing the kind of leadership that people want. And the answer, therefore, is that many countries are seeking to separate themselves a bit from both. I think we've seen this in Europe, perhaps most notably by the German government. Germany, just in the last few days, has been talking about taking its own path in some ways. And the United States is not taking this particularly well. You may have noticed the United States proposed to withdraw 9,500 troops from Germany and put them either somewhere else in Europe or maybe back in the United States. And so these kinds of moves are creating these countervailing dynamics where US allies are pulling away from the United States. And in some cases, the Trump administration seems to be pushing them even further. And so I think where we're headed is not towards what they called the G2, which some had predicted just a few years ago. It's a sort of US-China dominated world. And it's also not a G0 in the sense that there would be no leadership whatsoever, but we're going to be talking about a much more conflicted, divided world, a much more multipolar world, I think, where in Asia, for example, you're going to see much more leadership from Japan, from India, maybe some more from Australia, and from the governments in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And they're not always going to be taking the tack that the United States might like, and they're definitely not going to take the tack that China would like. And I think globally, you're seeing the Europeans step up and do much of the same. And so my guess is that we're headed towards a bit more multipolar world. This might have happened anyways, but I think the pandemic has accelerated this shift quite rapidly. And it reminds me a little bit of what we saw, at least in Asia, in the early 1970s. This is ancient history now, but just about exactly 50 years ago, Richard Nixon proposed something called the Guam Doctrine. And what he said was that Asian countries had to take care of themselves more than they had been. And what we saw from those Asian countries, I have a piece coming out on this that I'm working on with Lindsay Ford at the Brookings Institute, is that we saw many of these countries pull away from the United States as a result. They sought more autonomous strategies where they relied more on their own capabilities. They allied together, not with the United States, but with other countries around the region to provide sort of soft coalitions to balance the loss of US influence. And some of them actually accommodated to the communist regimes that they were worried about. And I think we're seeing the beginnings of all three in Asia. And so this is an incredibly difficult, worrisome time for an American strategist. I think many of the trends that we've started are going to be very difficult to reverse, unfortunately. And I worry greatly that the path we're heading towards as a result is one where either we're going to see decreased US presence in Asia, and President Trump has been explicit about this. Just in the last few days, you've probably seen the quotes with President Trump calling to withdraw large numbers of forces from Korea and Japan. The same is certainly possible in Europe as well, and the Middle East too. And even if Joe Biden wins in November, I think Joe Biden's going to be facing a pretty difficult landscape, one where the US government may have spent something like $7 or $8 trillion to get the pandemic under control and try and restart the economy. US defense enterprise, which is going to, as a result, be under increased pressure to make significant cutbacks in its spending. And I think bipartisan agreement that what we've been doing the last few years hasn't worked, but no clear agreement on what we should be doing instead. And so I'm very concerned about the path that we've been heading down and how to shift from this path to another one. Then maybe I'll just take a minute or two to outline, I think, what some of the core tenets of a different strategy might be that would get us back on the right path. So I think the first one is realizing that the United States is in a competition with China, but if we define that competition as a US-China competition, we've lost our greatest asset right off the bat, which is the fact that we have allies and China does not. We have allies because we've been a trusted partner, not a perfect partner, but a trusted partner to friends around the world for decades and decades. Not entirely altruistic, but also fairly altruistic in some significant moments. And China just doesn't have this history. It has one treaty with North Korea, which is probably not the ally you'd want if you were picking one. And at the same time, US allies are incredibly strong and prosperous. Japan, Korea, Australia, the Philippines, which is struggling at the moment, but a big and important country, right? And then partnerships with India, Taiwan, Indonesia that are significant. These are the kinds of relationships the United States should be doubling down on. And I think the United States can remember that, in fact, we're not in a competition by ourselves with China. This is largely a competition between China and much of the rest of the world over which of the systems that we use to govern ourselves work best. And I think if you look at what's happening in China these days, you're not going to find a lot of people around the world who say that they want to be part of a government that's sterilizing people in Xinjiang, that's walked away from the model in Hong Kong that was supposed to bring the two different systems under one country, but is increasingly bringing one system in one country. Pressure that we're seeing being put on almost all of China's neighbors, whether it's India or Taiwan or Vietnam or the Philippines or Malaysia. So I think what we're seeing around the world is a real shift to greater concern about China's actions, but also greater fear that the United States isn't going to be there to support these countries when it's needed most. So first, I think we need to double down on our alliances. And then the second move, and I know we'll talk about this more, is the United States is going to have to actually recommit to its defense posture in Asia. And this is something we've talked a lot about, but done very little on. Michelle Flournoy, who has a good chance of probably being the Secretary of Defense under Joe Biden if he wins, had a piece last week saying that there's been basically no change in US posture in Asia since President Obama announced the rebalance to Asia in 2011. And I think that's exactly right. You're talking about maybe hundreds, maybe a couple thousand new deployments in the region, but it is a very small number. And so if the United States is going to get serious about deterring China and reassuring its allies in Asia, we're going to have to get serious about putting our resources where it matters the most. And I think to date, we haven't done that. And so for me, those are the two critical elements that we have to see. And then finally, we have to get back to talking about American interests and American values, which are what brought so much of the world together in support of our objectives in the first place, right? It's not just this transactional America First approach that has been successful. It's also the fact that many people around the world embrace the values that America has stood for and haven't done so perfectly. I'm a graduate of the Woodrow Wilson School, which you may have seen changed its name the last few days. But one of the things that's different about us is we acknowledge our problems and we often try and come to terms with them, not perfectly. We have a huge amount of work to do, but this is not what's happening within the Communist Party. And so I think if we double down again on our values, that's the road back to the world that we want to live in, which is a world that is embracing America, where America is engaged and where we're actually strengthening our security globally and making sure that we're in a strong position for decades to come. So why don't I leave it there, and Paul and Bruce, look forward to the discussion with both of you.
Well, thank you so much. Before saying a final note, thanks to you, Dr. Cooper, I just have some general closing remarks because we've come to the end of our time. Thank you to everyone who joined us for this 7th webinar in our pandemic dialogues and the 3rd in our second phase, the series on reckoning and recovery. Please check our website. Again, that's scetl.asu.edu about our final upcoming webinar discussion of reckoning and recovery, the lessons of past recoveries of civic crises and how this COVID pandemic might affect the present and future of the United States. That final session will be discussing various approaches and plans for economic recovery. Registration for that webinar is open right now on our website. Also, if you enjoyed tonight's discussion, we recommend our podcast, The Pandemic Dialogues, discussing Camus' novel, The Plague. You can look for that. on our website, on iTunes, on other podcast platforms. You can connect via Twitter with the faculty who are conducting that discussion. 7 episodes of the podcast are now already posted on our website and elsewhere in podcast land. And as I mentioned, you can find archive recordings of the earlier sessions in these webinars on our website, on Thucydides, Boccaccio, Edgar Allan Poe, the zombie, recent craze and recent pop culture. And you can find archive recordings of our first 2 webinars already in this pandemic, the Reckoning and Recovery series. Those were on FDR and the New Deal and on health science and the common good. Recording of tonight's webinar should be up on our website in just the next few days. So I thank, as always, our colleagues in the school who made tonight's webinar possible. That would be Dr. Carol McNamara, our Associate Director for Public Programs, Dr. Carrese, who handled our questions for us behind the scenes, Joe Martin, our Communications Manager, and Morgan Raddick of our events team. And thanks again very much to our guest, Dr. Zack Cooper of the American Enterprise Institute for his insights and his expertise. Thank you to my colleague in the school, Colonel Bruce Pagel, for joining me on the panel. And to everyone, thank you, be well, be hopeful, and good night. Good evening, and welcome to the 7th episode of our virtual seminar series this year in the 2nd phase of our pandemic dialogues. We call this Reckoning and Recovery. I'm Paul Carrese, Director of the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Tonight's webinar is on the post-pandemic world order, great power competition, and the case of China. Part of our school's mission is to promote civic dialogue about pressing issues of our time, and each year our academic speaker series, the Civic Discourse Project, extends the conversations and debates of our classrooms to a broader community. Arizona PBS records those speaker events and broadcasts them. You can visit our website to see all of our previous lectures in the Civic Discourse Project. That's at scetl.asu.edu. And now, given the events of this spring and summer, we're offering a new virtual series, the Pandemic Dialogues, and we're doing it in 2 modes. First is these live webinars, which discuss a deeper perspective on pandemics or civic crisis, and also a podcast, which has been discussing Albert Camus' novel, The Plague. More information on these webinars, also on the Camus podcast, and in general, information about our school is at, again, scetl.asu.edu. So to continue our discussions of reckoning with and recovery from the current pandemic, we're delighted to welcome an expert on American national security and foreign policy, especially regarding China and the Asia Pacific. Dr. Zack Cooper of the American Enterprise Institute. And then joining me to pose questions is my faculty colleague, School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, Professor Bruce Pagel. We'll have 3 parts to the webinar this evening: an opening presentation from Dr. Cooper, then questions from Colonel Pagel and myself, and part 3, Q&A session from the virtual community that's joining us. So please do type your questions for our guests using Q&A feature in Zoom. And our colleague Carrese will be collecting those behind the scenes. And Colonel Pagel and I will posing questions to our guests in part 3. I told you also can use the hashtag pandemic dialogues on Twitter to participate in the discussion.
So in many places in Africa, in many places even in Southern Europe, Latin America, you have governments that need this money desperately, and they're happy to take some risks to get it. But throughout most of the world, if a country is asked whether they would like to take some investment from China that might come with some strings attached, or some investment from the United States or Europe or elsewhere, the answer is usually going to be that they'd rather have it from elsewhere. And so I think the path we're seeing, especially over the last few months, is just towards increased concerns in this way, as people have seen the risks of being this reliant on the Chinese Communist Party, which is willing to put these ties at risk for political purposes. So it's not to say that the rest of the world has answered the call. Part of the problem is if you're in Hungary, for example, or Serbia, it's much easier to get money from China than it is to get from, say, the United States or even from some in Europe. And so that Chinese money is going to be very alluring. And in fact, we've seen Serbia, for example, run some real risks to get it. But I think increasingly people are looking at the risks and wondering whether it's worth it. I co-authored a report last year with the Center for New American Security where we looked at the Belt and Road Initiative, and we looked at 10 projects related to the Belt and Road and assessed them for what I would call the 7 deadly sins, everything from the environmental standards the projects used to the debt that they incurred, to whether they relied on local labor, whether they came with political strings attached. And it's not that in every case, all of those 7 deadly sins are called into question, but in almost every one of these incidents, every Belt and Road project, there's 2 or 3 areas where countries are really deeply concerned, and for good reason. And I think over time that those are going to create real problems for the Communist Party as it seeks to move out into the rest of the world.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to ask an extension of your basic thesis that there was competition or growing tension in the US-China relationship even before the pandemic. So during the past few months of the pandemic, we've heard some discussion in America about decoupling from China and even some bipartisan agreement on this, that the pandemic has exposed the danger of American overdependence on China and its supply chains, particularly medical products, strategic minerals. But again, before the pandemic, one of the ways of analysts talking about the tension in the relationship was security experts referring to the Thucydides Trap, this thesis about great power competition derived from Thucydides, who was the first topic of our first pandemic dialogue. The great historian had contended that the rise of Athens as a power in the Mediterranean world threatened to displace the then dominant ruling military power, Sparta, and this instability and the threat made war seemingly inevitable. So my big question, long question, do you think that Athens-Sparta analogy holds in any way, this particular thesis transition? Is that a good model for understanding the current US-China relationship? And then more generally, is the more pessimistic view plausible and reasonable about the US-China relationship, or is it really fear of our relative decline sparking an aggressiveness that's not really prudent?
It's a fantastic question. And I would start by saying, I'm not sure we're in a power transition. I think we're in a power shift. And it's important that the two are different. And I actually think many in China don't appreciate this difference. So it's very clear that power has been shifting from the United States to China in relative terms for some time. You can just look at relative GDP and see how rapidly China has grown. The US actually hasn't declined nearly as rapidly as China has grown. The US has done pretty well, but it's still gone down in relative terms over the last few decades, and China has skyrocketed, right? Almost 30 years of double-digit economic growth will do that. But I don't think we should assume that this is going to continue, right? The problems in China are severe. Environmental problems, political problems, demographic problems. And it's not clear that the Chinese Communist Party has answers to many of these problems. And so one of the real challenges is that I think many in China believe we're in a power transition where China is inevitably going to pass the United States. And actually my view, talking to policymakers in the United States, in Washington especially, is that many in Washington are not sure that we're going to be in a power transition at all. They think the power shift may go back in America's direction because if you look at the demographics, for example, yes, China has a huge, huge population, but in fact, the size of the Chinese population is going to decrease in coming decades, while the United States is likely to continue rising. And the Chinese population is going to be dealing with a middle income trap, which is a very difficult thing to get out of. And the Chinese Communist Party doesn't necessarily seem to have the answers for this. So it's going to get old before it gets rich. And this is a huge problem. And so I think one possibility is that we are at the beginning of what Graham Allison and others have called the Thucydides Trap. But that actually we're not going to get to the end of it because we're not actually going to see the power directions actually cross. We're going to see them get close and then maybe China fall off a bit. So that's one reality that I think we should all keep in mind. We shouldn't just assume that China is going to continue to grow. The second point I would make is it's not that these power shifts always lead to conflict, right? My boss at the American Enterprise Institute, Corey Shockey, has written a great book on the United States and the UK and how they transitioned power between the US and the UK. And there wasn't a war between the two, and that transition went fine. I think the problem is there's not a lot of trust between the American government and the Chinese Communist Party. And the responsible stakeholder idea, which many of us bought into 15 years ago, which was that China was going to integrate into the system and buy into that system and be changed by that system, seems to have failed. And in fact, now what we're seeing is a Communist Party that's doubling down on more authoritarian policies. It's not opening up, it's doing the exact opposite. And so I think the part of the Thucydides trap that I do believe is real is that unless these two governments have some level of trust, it's going to be very difficult for them to come to agreements on ways to alter the existing order in any peaceful way. And so the place I worry about the most is in Taiwan, where I think both countries have real serious commitments, and it's going to be very difficult for either one to walk away from them. And so I worry not tomorrow or the next day, but as the military balance shifts into 2025 and 2030, 2035, that I think there's going to be increased tension around Taiwan, especially military tension, and that we absolutely could see serious conflict erupt there.
Very interesting. We need to turn to Bruce. A second question to you, but one, analogies can only hold so much so far. The role of Persia in the conflict between the Athenian alliance and the Spartan alliance, there's no, Russia is not quite that. And to the advantage of America or the liberal democracies is that potential power of India sitting there, a liberal democracy and having its own fraught relations with China, and how we could, as you said, how we could cultivate alliances or potential alliances. But Bruce, maybe someone will ask a question about India in our Q&A section. Bruce, to you. And Bruce, you'll need to unmute. Or I can go on talking about India if you prefer. That's, we can. There he is.
Technology sometimes gets the better of me. Quickly, turning to operational considerations, a topic closer to my interests. Given the increasingly aggressive activity in the South China Sea, a generally more assertive China, and the military technology advances that China is touting, which include an organically built 21st century aircraft carrier, a new strategic bomber, advanced anti-ship missile capability, cutting edge hypersonic technology, state-of-the-art anti-access and area denial weapons, and increasingly active espionage and disinformation activity leveled against the US. What would you recommend as the optimal force posture in the Indo-Pacific region, balancing, on the one hand, the need to convincingly deter China from using military force against its neighbors, while at the same time avoiding deployments or postures that appear too provocative?
It's such a difficult challenge. And I will admit that I think here, I have some strong views, and they're probably not completely in alignment with the views of others you'd listen to in Washington. So you should take them with a grain of salt. So my view is that if you think about the changes happening in Asia right now, we're seeing two major changes. One is China's rise relative to the United States, and the other is that power projection is becoming more and more difficult. It's becoming more difficult because increasingly autonomous systems are able to find and hit very big and advanced sets of forces, whether they're aircraft carriers at sea or fixed bases on land. And as a result, the ability to project power is increasingly in question, and the price is going up. And so many people say, okay, China's getting stronger. The US has been a power projection military for decades. Both of these trends work against the United States. My view is actually the opposite. My view is, yes, China's getting stronger. That's deeply concerning. But for China to change the status quo where it lives in Asia, it's going to have to project power. And most of the time, except on the India-China border, it's going to have to project power over water, which is incredibly difficult. And the status quo is actually in America's favor. So if we can check China and prevent China from, say, taking control of Taiwan or being convinced that it could take control of Taiwan, then we can obtain our objectives. And that doesn't always require us to be able to project power. It only requires us to be able to deny the ability of China to project power itself. And so I think where the United States is going to be heading is away from its reliance on aircraft carriers, away from its reliance on big fixed bases that are hard to defend, and towards a set of capabilities that are much harder for China to see and to hit. Things like undersea systems, especially attack submarines, where the United States is a huge lead in technology. Systems like long-range strike systems, cruise missiles. These are all the kinds of systems that actually make it more difficult for anyone to project power. And so in a world where the United States just wants to uphold the status quo and make the price of China trying to change that status quo much higher, I think those are the systems we're going to see increasingly in favor. It's going to be harder to reassure our allies with those systems. They like to see the big flashy systems, flying in, sailing into their ports. But at the end of the day, I think in a major contingency with China, it's largely going to be our long-range aircraft and our undersea systems that are going to do a bunch of the early fighting, and that's where we're going to have to put our money.
Terrific. Thank you for that interview portion. We now have some very fine questions that have come into our queue, and I recognize the names of several students in our school, and also some students who are involved in the Alexander Hamilton Society chapter at ASU, and they saw Dr. Cooper speak earlier this year. So first is from Anna Espinoza. This keys off your mention, Dr. Cooper, of American values as well as American interests. To what extent do you see the recent racial tensions in the US, partly exacerbated by the pandemic, damaging international perceptions of American values and our altruism?
That's a fantastic question, and I think the challenges we have in our democracy are real. We've all known about them, and often we don't do enough about them. And this has been a reminder to all of us that we have huge racial problems that have to be dealt with, and with much greater urgency than has occurred in the past. My personal view is, this is actually what differentiates us from China. It doesn't make us look more like China. In China, there's a news story today, which I mentioned earlier briefly, that the government of China is sterilizing a huge number of Uyghur women in China to prevent them from having children, which is frankly just genocide.
To be clear, this is the Muslim minority population that lives in the western part, the southwestern part of China.
That's right. And so that is how China is dealing with its racial, religious problems. In the United States, we're having large protests, and things little by little are changing. That doesn't mean that we get it right. That doesn't mean that we don't make huge mistakes. But the virtue of a democracy is that we change our policies. We fix our mistakes little by little. We make many, no one doubts that, but our system is built to fix those problems and to do so openly and transparently to the extent that it's possible. And I think that to the extent that people around the world see the United States struggling with these huge problems in our society, that should reassure them that actually America's not perfect. We've never said that America was perfect, but that when we make mistakes, we can fix them. And I think that's what stands us apart from the Communist Party, where, you know, what's happening tomorrow in China? Well, they're passing a national security law to crack down on the protests in Hong Kong. It's the opposite of how we deal with our problems.
Thank you. Bruce, a question from your
Yes, sir. This is from John Reganati. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And it's related really to the last question, at least on the margins. He wants you, to know how you see society changing as a result of this century's pandemic. How is it changing permanently?
That's a tough question and an important one. I don't think we know yet is the short answer. And I guess my initial reaction is that I think all of us are seeing bits of our lives change in ways that we know they're probably not going to go back to, right? I used to be on an airplane every few weeks to Asia. I don't think that's happening, not just in the next few years, but I think increasingly people see, you know, fora like this, where you can have substantive discussions and you don't all physically need to be in the same place. Those are some, you know, ways that the world is changing that I think are probably less important. The ones that I worry more about are the economic changes in the country that this is going to cause. And I don't think we really have a full handle on that. You know, I see this on the university side, right? Where I think a lot of us are asking, how do we engage students effectively when we're not in person? What's the value proposition of a university, right? Not just the social proposition, but also the educational proposition, and to what degree does that have to be done in person? And so I think this is going to affect a huge portion of societies globally. Now, my basic view is that I think the United States is pretty well prepared for this, right? We are a society that, despite our many problems, we do one thing really well, which is that we build really creative people. That, you know, our schooling system may be behind some others on science and math. I know Arizona State's doing everything it can to fix that. But even though we're behind in those areas, where do you see the giant innovating companies come from in the world? It's, you know, Silicon Valley, it's Arizona increasingly, right? It's Texas, it's much of the middle of the country where we don't talk about, where there are small startups that are doing incredible things. And that kind of innovation is really hard for others to grow. And I think that's what's really going to be prized in the economies we're heading to. So, you know, it's not a clear vision in my mind. I think we're at the beginning of this transition, but I do think in a lot of ways it plays to America's strengths, as long as we can get the pandemic under control and you know, protect the economy over the next few months and years.
Thank you. And you mentioned earlier that just the effect of the debt, the increased federal debt, to respond to this crisis after there had already been 30 years of very extensive additions to federal debt, and what that meant for American military spending and security posture. So now a question from Cameron Vega about some current issues and how they might be affecting U.S. strategic calculations in East Asia. One is, how significant is the suspension of the Aegis ashore mission defense sites? And the other is, how significant is the debate over the development of Japanese-led missile strike capabilities and Article 9? So those two.
Great questions. Thanks, Cameron. So let me back out for 1 second and say, as someone who studies Asia and defense alliances, I will tell you there's no more important ally in the world for the United States than Japan. And the reason is twofold. First, people tend to forget this, but you know, Japan is still the third largest economy in the world. It's a huge economy and an advanced economy. And it's had its struggles the last few decades, but Japan is hugely important. And it's important not just economically, but also politically and geographically. Politically, because it is a very, very positive force in Asia. If you look at polling data about who is most trusted in Asia, it's not Donald Trump or Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin. It's Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan. And part of this is because Japan has a long record of providing substantial economic aid throughout much of Asia, especially into Southeast Asia, which is really important. And Japan politically, therefore, has a critical role to play. But also from a military standpoint, Japan has a very capable self-defense force. And in addition, it is living in the most important part of the world for the United States, in my view, which is Northeast Asia, East Asia. And it controls a chain of islands that run not just along the main Japanese islands, but all the way down through Okinawa, almost all the way to Taiwan. And that is where the United States has its bases, many of its bases in Asia where it projects power. So Japan is absolutely critical for us. And that alliance is probably the strongest alliance at the moment that we have in Asia, the most capable alliance, but also a pretty tricky one for us. As Cameron mentioned, the United States wrote the Japanese Constitution. When we did that, we prevented Japan from having some of the kinds of military capabilities that we'd like them to have today. And so as we encourage Japan to develop the kinds of capabilities that are needed to defend not only Japan, but the United States' presence in Japan as well, we're encountering some of the historical challenges that we ourselves brought when we occupied Japan. And I think we've been working very closely with the Japanese government to get through many of those, but it's going to be a challenging process. And as Cameron mentioned, the current challenge at the moment is that Japan is struggling with something called Aegis Ashore, which is basically a missile defense system. This system in Japan is placed largely to protect against incoming missiles from North Korea against likely Tokyo. The idea was to put these missiles on shore. If you have two of these sites on shore, then you don't have to have two destroyers sitting constantly offshore. And those two destroyers aren't just two destroyers because it basically takes 3 ships to maintain one out at sea at any one time. So basically the Japanese decided that they were going to build 2 static sites in Japan instead of buying 6 missile defense destroyers, which are very expensive, to sit out in the Sea of Japan and watch for a North Korean missile launch. And they've had to roll this back the last few months due to some challenges, both technical challenges and concerns among the local population that the missiles, if they shoot them down, might land near their cities. And I would say this is the same case with every one of our alliances in Asia. We just have to work through these problems little by little. It's quiet diplomacy, but it's what is hugely important in the region. And I'm pretty confident that we're going to get through this with Japan. The relationship is really strong, arguably the best relationship any US ally has around the world with Donald Trump is the US-Japan relationship, due largely to Shinzo Abe's huge efforts from day one of the administration. But the challenges are real, and I've written a lot about some of the future challenges for the alliance. And one of them, and this is where I'll leave it, is that eventually Japan is going to stop having to be only the shield that protects the United States' presence in Japan. And the US is going to stop being only the sword that protects the alliance. And we're actually going to have to switch some of those roles. And there will be times when we need Japan to actually have the ability to take some offensive action on its own. But it's going to take years potentially for the Japanese people to get to the point where they're willing to accept those kinds of changes. And we're going to have to be very patient.
Interesting. Okay, Bruce, a question from your side?
Okay, thank you. So this is a question from Madison Goodballot, a former student of mine, actually. It's a little long, but it includes some topics that other students have asked. So bear with me. She writes, Dr. Dan Blumenthal recently wrote in the National Review in an article called China Unquarantined that, quote, the world is suffering a planetary plague because China today is deeply integrated into the world economy and into the institutions of global governance as well. Her question is, do you agree with this assessment? And if so, how might US allies address China's growing economic prowess? And what different decisions might the US and China have made over the past few decades that would have produced a better outcome in China-American relations?
It's a fantastic question. And Dan is a good friend, and he brought me to AEI initially, so I can't disagree with that comment. I'll just build on it, which is to say that I think what we've seen is a growing desire in the United States to start decoupling in some areas from China. But let's be very honest, this decoupling didn't start in the United States at all. In fact, it was Beijing that began the decoupling years and years ago. So I'll give you a couple of examples. This is being streamed on Facebook right now. Do you think anyone in China is watching it? Probably not, unless they're using a really good VPN service. Why? Well, it's not because the US bans Facebook from operating in China. It's because China bans Facebook. And it also bans Google. And it bans Twitter. Major US companies. And I could go on down the line for quite some time. So we talk about decoupling sometimes as if this was started by the US government in 2017. But the reality is that China's been decoupled from key parts of the US economy for years. In fact, the most vibrant parts in some ways of the US economy are just not allowed to operate in China at all. And we're seeing that increasingly, not just with social media and big tech companies, but with news media, right? So we saw the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post reporters getting kicked out of Beijing. And so I think what we're seeing is decoupling across the board. And it's accelerating now, absolutely, with the COVID crisis. But the reality is that it didn't start with COVID. And it didn't start in Washington. It started in Beijing as a way for Beijing to protect itself against the concepts of freedom and openness that were, dangerous in the minds of many Communist Party leaders. And so I do think we're going to see more decoupling. I probably wouldn't go quite as far as Dan might in suggesting that we decouple the two economies deeply, but I certainly think that there are going to be a lot of areas where we want to have more dependence on ourselves and less dependence on China. And here I would vote for what Robert Gates, the former Secretary of Defense, called the small yard, high fence rule, which is don't ban lots of things, ban a small number. But if you're going to protect those certain sectors, do it really seriously. Wall off, for example, some information technology where we're worried about Huawei or ZTE. Wall off, critical microchips that we think are important for defense purposes. Those kinds of areas. But there are going to be other ones that, frankly, I think it's fine for us to remain coupled. I have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. Most of their toys say made in China. I don't think that's particularly problematic. But if we're buying missiles from China or missiles that include Chinese microchips, that's absolutely something that it should have stopped years ago.
So we have too many good questions in the queue, I think, at least Bruce, I do. So could I ask you to do just a couple of rapid fire answers? This one is from our own Luke Perez. As you mentioned, you thought we should be more invested in alliances, but that there is some retrenchment, restraint theory that might last into even a Democratic administration if Vice President Biden were elected. So sketch out that scenario that you don't recommend. If America is skeptical or retrenching, restraining, which alliances would falter even though we need them, especially alliances regarding China?
I think it's, maybe this is my hopefulness about where the Biden team would go, but I think if they were coming in, actually, you wouldn't see a lot of damage done in Asia. The Philippines and Thailand are probably the two tricky ones because those political relationships are dependent on leaders who have been increasingly authoritarian. And that's hard for many Democrats to stomach. It's hard for some Republicans too, but it's really the Democrats that have taken a leadership role in putting restrictions on cooperation with governments that are not open to free elections. So those are the two in Asia. I think the place that you'd really see a change is in the Middle East. I cannot imagine the US-Saudi relationship looking particularly good a year from now if Joe Biden wins. And I'm not suggesting that it should look particularly good given what's happened over the last few years. But I think to the extent that Biden administration would have to make some hard decisions about its engagement, I think it would be doubling down in Asia, probably doubling down in Europe, and pulling back somewhat in the Middle East, where it just doesn't think it has a lot of reliable democratic governments that it can build not just similar interests with, but also similar values.
Bruce, do you have one last one? It's in your queue, or should I pose one?
I have one, thanks. This is from Justin Kopak. He asks, or writes, some pundits and politicians have been highly critical of the World Health Organization's initial response to the pandemic in China. How should the pandemic impact our approach to multilateral institutions, and specifically the UN? And should we take on a larger leadership role or remove ourselves as much as possible from such institutions?
I'm going to differ again with some of the president's policies here. My view is that those were institutions we built. They were institutions we built not just because we're altruistic, but because they locked in our power over the long term. And so we should be doubling down on our investment in those institutions, which is not to say that the WHO is perfect. It made some very serious mistakes at the beginning of this crisis. But part of the problem is that as the US pulls away from some of these institutions, as it stops funding them, it gives China more leverage in them. So if you want to compete, you've got to be in the room. You've got to be funding these institutions. You've got to be there. And oh, by the way, if we want to compete in these institutions, we've got some pretty good friends to do it with, right? Our European allies, our Asian allies, they're deeply engaged. They're very active. So my view is the point of these institutions, most of which were created by the United States, was as a way to lock in US power, and walking away from them doesn't undo this. It doesn't undo China's influence in them, it just maximizes it. So I think we've got to get back to our engagement in these institutions, as frustrating as it can be. And I understand that. I spent a summer once at NATO, and I can tell you working in Brussels, on consensus-based institutions is incredibly frustrating at times, but that's important, and that's what leadership looks like.
Thank you so much. Before saying a final note, thanks to you, Dr. Cooper, I just have some general closing remarks because we've come to the end of our time. Thank you to everyone who joined us for this 7th webinar in our pandemic dialogues, and the 3rd in our 2nd phase, the series on reckoning and recovery. Please check our website. Again, that's scetl.asu.edu about our final upcoming webinar discussion of reckoning recovery, lessons of past recoveries of civic crises, and how this COVID pandemic might affect the present and future of the United States. That final session will be discussing various approaches and plans for economic recovery. Registration for that webinar is open right now on our website. Also, if you enjoyed tonight's discussion, we recommend our podcast in the Pandemic Dialogues, discussing Camus' novel, The Plague. You can look for that on our website, on iTunes, on other podcast platforms. You can connect via Twitter with the faculty who are conducting that discussion. 7 episodes of the podcast are now already posted on our website and elsewhere in podcast land. And as I mentioned, you can find archive recordings of the earlier sessions in these webinars on our website, on Thucydides, Boccaccio, Edgar Allan Poe, the zombie craze in recent pop culture. And you can find archive recordings of our first 2 webinars already in this pandemic, the Reckoning and Recovery series. Those were on FDR and the New Deal, and on health science and the common good. Recording of tonight's webinar should be up on our website in just the next few days. So I thank, as always, our colleagues in the school who made tonight's webinar possible. That would be Dr. Carol McNamara, our Associate Director for Public Programs, Dr. Luke Perez, who handled our questions for us behind the scenes, Joe Martin, our Communications Manager, and Morgan Raddick of our events team. Thanks again very much to our guest, Dr. Zack Cooper of the American Enterprise Institute, for his insights and his expertise. Thank you to my colleague in the school, Colonel Bruce Pagel, for joining me on the panel. And to everyone, thank you, be well, be hopeful, and good night.